Welcome. We have the privilege this morning of hearing from the president of Barnard College and the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, each separately and then in conversation about the future of higher education. We will hear first from President Spar, then from Chancellor Eisen. We'll see. They'll open it up to you first, or are they in conversation? We'll have the opportunity for some dialogue on this issue. Their full bios are in the program, so I won't repeat them for you. But I actually never really thought about it, that each is the seventh leader of their respective institutions. And each is relatively new in their tenure. So each institution is blessed with renewed visionary leadership at this time, and we're delighted to have this opportunity to hear from them. President Spar.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I must confess this is my first time physically at JTS, even though it's only 2 blocks away from my office. But welcome to life on the Upper West Side. But it's a wonderful opportunity to come expand my view of the neighborhood. I was just saying it's a lovely space. I love being here. And I hope this will now be an opportunity for me to come here more frequently and to expand the already wonderful and strong links that have existed for so long between Barnard and JTS. So Shirley gave the very positive spin on this, that it's a moment of rebirth and opportunity for those of us who have moved into leadership positions. As someone who became president of a small, poor college about 6 weeks before Wall Street collapsed, I'm not sure that it felt like such a great opportunity when I was watching my endowment dwindle to nothing before my eyes. But it certainly has been and remains a fascinating time to be the leader of an institution of higher education in this country. And so what I want to do this morning is just, as you can see, I don't have very formal remarks prepared, just actually throw out a couple of points that will give you some sense of sort of where my head is these days, and will hopefully spark some conversation and perhaps even dialogue, which is always fun. So I want to start by talking about the financial pressures that we are facing, and I'm very much using the royal we here, that it's not just Barnard College, but higher education in general. And the pressures are severe. And they're severe not just in a how do I balance the checkbook kind of way, but they are severe enough, I think, that the entire educational sector in this country is and should be going through a massive moment of reflection. Because I think, as one could say, and I think should say with regard to the financial sector more generally, we are at a moment where we need to rethink the models that have been in existence for several decades. And I think if we don't take this moment to rethink how we do our business, we're really not only losing an opportunity, but we may be setting ourselves very much on the wrong path. So what do these financial pressures look like? The most obvious one is that all colleges, universities, educational institutions, day schools have seen their endowments crumble over the past 18 months. They're a little better now than they were 6 months ago, but they've all fallen. And there's this odd competition going on. Well, Harvard's fell by 27, we only fell by 26, we're doing great. But the truth of the matter is that we're all down, and we're all down a lot. And there's a wonderful irony going on. I keep referring to the irony of poverty, that actually the poorer institutions did better than the richer ones. So, as I always say to my donors, this doesn't mean I don't want you to give me money, but it does mean that what we've seen happen, and it's really quite intriguing, is that a lot of the wealthiest schools in this country, and I would include not just the obvious colleges here, but private schools, day schools, had gotten very reliant on their endowments, particularly over the past 15 years. I call it the David Swensen model, David Swensen being the investment manager at Yale, who did such a phenomenal job. But many schools had reached a point where the endowments were growing 18, 20% a year, and they were funding their operating budget off the endowment. And the extreme cases being places like Harvard or Williams, which had become so reliant that the endowment was funding about 60% of their operating budget. This is wonderful as long as the endowment is growing. When the endowment stops growing, it's crisis. And that's what we fell into last year. And I will always remember a moment I had gone to one of these symposia at Aspen right before I took my job, where a very famous investment manager was talking about how universities were really the only place in the world that could afford to be long-term investors, because they really were there for the long term. And so they could afford to be in hedge funds and alternate investments and all this. No. It turned out, even though universities are hopefully around for a long time, they spend money on a daily basis. And of course, what universities primarily spend money on, financial aid and salary of tenured faculty, neither of which can be cut back nor should be cut back quickly. So in some ways, sorry, I've spent 17 years at Harvard Business School, so you'll excuse this coming through. We are running business models that don't make sense. And I think it is incumbent upon us not just to look for all the shekels under the couch, as I keep saying, but really rethink how we run our businesses. Because we have a responsibility to our faculty, to our students, and to our communities. And I'm not sure we have responsible models right now. So I really think this is a moment to rethink at a very profound level, how do you fund higher education in this country? The second piece, which worries me a lot, and I think worries me more than I know it worries some of my other college presidents, our price tags are really high. A Barnard College education costs over $50,000 a year. Gasp of surprise from the audience. But my students in the back can confirm a Barnard College education costs over $50,000 a year. This is not because we have luxurious accommodations or climbing walls or jacuzzis for our students' tired knees. That's what it costs primarily to fund our two biggest expenses, again, financial aid and faculty salaries. This is no longer a story, I don't think, that the American people are going to put up with very easily. And just watch what happens 2 or 3 weeks from now when college acceptances come out. So there's a whole sort of flurry of cute stories about, isn't it wonderful that little Johnny got into Williams or wherever little Johnny got into. But there's an equal flurry of stories that say this is no longer sustainable because little Johnny's parents can't afford $52,000 a year. And I suspect once the papers stop beating up on Wall Street, which will eventually simmer down a little bit, college is maybe the next villain out there. Because if we believe, as I think most of us would, I presume everyone in this room believes, that higher education is critical, how can it be so expensive to the point now that only 5% of American families can afford to pay the full price for college? So what every school is doing, every private school, is they're taking money from the families that can pay, literally handing it out the door to the families which can't pay, which on the one hand is a wonderful socialist model, but it's probably not a sustainable model. And you start to get into all kinds of what the economists would call moral hazard, that what happens with the middle-class families that dutifully put money aside and they are the ones fitting the bill, and in many cases we have wealthier families who aren't putting money aside because they know that the kids can get financial aid, and financial aid is not based on what you've earned, it's what you have in the bank. I think it's a very scary model. Yes, you're looking at me in surprise. Financial aid is based largely on your assets at a given moment. So there's nothing that says to a family, gee, you should have put money aside when you were earning $200,000 a year. We just look at your assets. This is all federal formulas. So my guess is that we are going to see a lot of public pressure, as we should, on the financing model of higher education. And look what's happening at Berkeley right now. I mean, we're reaching a point that the demonstrations at Berkeley are getting violent. Hunter College had demonstrations last week in support of Berkeley. On the one hand, the demonstrations make no sense because the students are beating up the chancellors of the UC system who really have no power. They get their money from the state. But it speaks to the greater frustration. How do we fund higher education? And when we don't come up with solutions, the places that are attacked physically, I think we will see with increased frequency, are the universities themselves. So this is something that actually worries me a lot, not about what's going to happen next month, but what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think we have an underlying financial model that works. And I'm sure depending on the age of you in this room, I know my father always used to say, he grew up in Yonkers, that he could afford to put himself through college by working as an elevator operator over the summer. Now, first of all, elevator operators don't exist anymore, but the bigger issue is there's no summer job you can have that's legal that will pay for you to go to college. When I was growing up, my parents were comfortable middle-class people, but they were able relatively easily to put aside enough money for my brother and I to go to college, and I could earn enough money to pay for my graduate school. And no one was really burdened by it. I have 3 kids now. I make a very high salary compared to the vast bulk of American people. Paying to put 3 kids through college right now is becoming a multi-million-dollar endeavor. It's just not sustainable. So that's the most depressing thing I'm going to say. Let me turn to several less depressing things. I think another thing we're seeing, which doesn't worry so much as it intrigues me, is a battle, or at least a dilemma or pressure points emerging between the classic liberal arts education and the pre-professional education. And I think this relates to the economic situation, albeit in different ways. Increasingly, we are seeing students and parents saying, for all that money, what is my kid getting out of it? When my daughter graduates, what is she going to do? Is she going to get a job? Has she been trained for something? Or is she going to have to go out and now get a degree that will enable her to get a job? Again, when the economy was doing well, I think people were more willing to say, college years are a time of exploration, reflection, and then the child can go out and get a professional degree. I think we're going to have less indulgence of that particular view. And I think those of us, and I'm very much in this camp, who count ourselves as being devoted to the liberal arts are going to have a tougher time making this argument. We really need to think about the value of a liberal arts education if it is not an education that directly prepares its students to enter the workforce. So if we had more time, I could give you chapter and verse as to why I think a liberal arts education is indeed so valuable, and perhaps maybe more valuable today. But it's an argument that takes a fair amount of time to elaborate. It is not instantly obvious. And I think those of us in the liberal arts community have to be building that argument and making it more loudly to the public. The third thing that I think about a lot, and indeed I'm working on a lot, is globalization. My background is in international relations, so I fundamentally believe and have always believed, or have long believed, that we are living in a world that is becoming increasingly global. I think that train has left the station. I don't think we're going back. Even though we may have moments of isolationism or pangs of nostalgia for a smaller and more insular world, we're not going there. We live in a world that is increasingly interconnected across national and international lines. For many years, I think American higher education had a sort of quasi-colonial mentality, if you will, that as the world became global, our job was to export our expertise, set up schools in China, send our students abroad for foreign exchange programs. That's changing now. Look at what's happening at higher education in China. They are building, I forget what the number is, but 35 colleges a year, fully funded, paid for by the state, very high quality education, very different than ours, but pretty high quality, actually very high quality education. China is not going to be sending its students to us for much longer. We're going to be sending our students to China, and we're going to start losing the PhD students from China, India, Russia, Korea, who have quietly been manning vast bulk of our PhD programs, particularly in the sciences. And we are going to have to think through what this aspect of globalization means. At Barnard, we've been doing a couple of things that I'm very proud of, so I will now brag, in pursuit of globalization. We started a series of symposia last year. We're going to hopefully continue these every year, where we're looking at the role of women in different parts of the world. So we had a conference last year in China on the role of women in changing China. We're going to the Middle East, actually this week, to look at the role of women in the Arab world, not an obvious topic of conversation. And the plan is to go to Africa next year to look at women as peacemakers on the African continent, and keep going. What we're also doing is we've started a study abroad program in reverse. So we've signed agreements with schools, thus far mostly in in China and Korea. And when we send our juniors abroad, for their junior year abroad, we bring Chinese and Korean and European students to our campus for their junior year. So we have 41 Chinese students on campus right now, which is an amazing experience both for them and our students. We just received money to expand it next year to bring 6 African students as well. And after I go to the Middle East, I'm going to Russia because we have interest in from Moscow State University. So we are internationalizing our campus in a small but I think very significant way. Part of this also has to do with, I think, what I see as a very important both buzzword and reality. We need to diversify our campuses, not only internationally and globally, but in terms of race, where we still have not done a very good job despite decades of ostensible efforts, and again, I'm using the royal we here, and in terms of socioeconomic diversity. And again, as the financial situation gets worse, the dirty little secret is that it's going to become harder to get poorer kids into these very expensive institutions of higher learning. But it's critical. I think if we don't remain constantly vigilant about this prong of diversity, we're laying the groundwork for what could become serious social unrest. So we have to maintain access and diversity across a wide range of issues. And finally, just very briefly, we have to think about and think seriously about what our role is and what our responsibility is to create citizens. That's gotten lost, perhaps less so at JTS than I think at more secular places. But what does it mean to train citizens for the world? What does it mean to train citizens for service in this country? Last year, it was wonderful to see the rise of interest among our students during the election. And I saw more student involvement in politics and more student interest in government service than I have ever seen before. It's diminished just over the course of 12 months, and I think that's very scary. I did an interview last week with the Atlantic Monthly, doing a story on a good friend of mine who's just written a very important book, and the story is about there was a group of us who were at graduate school together in Harvard studying government 20 years ago. Where have we all wound up? And we had a very good class, and I won't mention names here, but some of the most prominent journalists in this country were in our class, some now very prominent academics, some schlumps are running colleges and things like that. But what I was pointing out, and the journalist was saying, isn't this amazing that the members of this class have risen to positions of such political prominence? And I said, no, you've gotten it backwards. There's one of us who's actually working for government. So here were people who studied government, ostensibly the best and the brightest, and none of us, with the exception of Zeke Emanuel, who's struggling to create some kind of healthcare policy, none of us are actually working for the public good. And that scares me. So I'm sorry, I told you I'd be optimistic. I've given you nothing but pessimism. But let me hope that Arnie can turn it around.
Well, it's an honor to be here today and to have Professor Spar here to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the double degree program and help us celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Teachers Institute. I'm going to pick up where President Spar left off and talk about values that lead us in the direction of citizenship and diversity. Under the category of the teaching that we learn a lot from our teachers, but we learn more from our students, I want to recount an experience that I had at Stanford about 10 years ago. After teaching a course, a humanities course, where we looked at the first 3 chapters of Genesis and then looked at a variety of interpretations, ancient and modern, Christian and Jewish, philosophical, anthropological, psychological, et cetera, of these creation stories. And at the end of the course, I said to the students, so what was your favorite interpretation of all that we read? And almost unanimously, they said Soloveitchik's essay, The Lonely Man of Faith, in which Rabbi Soloveitchik lays out a theory that the interpretation of why we have 2 different creation stories is there are 2 different sides of the self. The first he calls Adam the First. Adam the First is the Adam, the part of us that is endowed with what he calls majesty. the ability to master the universe, to use science and mathematics to exercise control. And so when we ride in jet planes or work to cure cancer, we are acting as Adam the first. But Adam the second is the Adam that enters into covenant, that loves, that has relationship. And my students said, we like this text so much because this is the division between our lives at Stanford. We are two selves at Stanford. We're one self in class, and we're another self outside of class. And they didn't make a distinction particularly between humanities classes and science classes. They made a distinction between class and outside of class. They felt themselves, the major parts of themselves, the selves that are exploring love and relationship and friendship and commitment, do not get expression or nurture inside the classroom. This was kind of sad. And to a professor of religion, it's particularly difficult because if you're in the business of teaching religion or the business of teaching philosophy, you hope that in the classroom you're able to bridge the gap between these two, and yet you know that to some extent, because you are in a Weberian university of so-called value-free science, right, that it's hard to bridge that gap. And you wonder, for example, when you realize as a university that you want to teach your students ethics, whether teaching them the history of ethics is actually going to make them more ethical. But then you wonder, if you try to actually teach ethics, whether you can find agreement in your philosophy department, let alone in your university, as to what ethics is and what these values are that you should be teaching. And so you end up teaching what Alasdair MacIntyre, the philosopher, called second-order values and not first-order values. Second-order values are values of pluralism and tolerance and respect for people who disagree, rather than first-order values which tell you what you should actually care for. What is truth? What is goodness? Second-order values you can teach. Values clarification. We can help students come to a conclusion about what their values should be. But first-order values are not the business of the university. And so you end up preserving this gap that the students are feeling between what they have in class and what they have outside of class. I was reminded of this experience a couple weeks ago when I got an article that Lisa Miller, the religion correspondent of Newsweek, wrote in Newsweek about what she called Harvard's crisis of faith. I read you the first couple lines from the first couple of paragraphs. It doesn't take a degree from Harvard to see that in today's world, a person needs to know something about religion. That's line one. And people agree with this at Harvard too. I don't pick on you because it's an alma mater. I have nothing, no. Just but it gets attention. But in practice, the Harvard faculty cannot cope with religion. It cannot agree on who should teach it, how it should be taught, and how much value to give it compared with economics, biology, literature, and all the other subjects considered vital to an undergraduate education. It turns out that a professor named Louis Menand had led a group proposing a requirement in the Harvard curriculum that all undergraduate students should be required to take at least one course in a category called Reason and Faith. And the scientist Steven Pinker, the evolutionary psychologist, led the case against the religion requirement, sorry. He argued that the primary goal of Harvard education is the pursuit of truth through rational inquiry, and that religion has no place in that. Now, I'm, of course, not very happy with the notion that religion is something that is free of rational inquiry, as Professor Pinker insisted. But I'm not sure I want religion studied under a dichotomy of faith and reason either. I don't like that very much. And if that's going to be the guide to the study of religion, that we're leaving the sphere of reason and going to something else called faith, then you're betraying, I think, everything that Judaism has insisted on for 3 millennia and insists on from the Bible onwards. So we're here not to divide ourselves or our students up into an area called faith and an area called reason, but to try to create whole selves. And even though in practice, wholeness is a virtue that we say God has and is very elusive to human beings, nonetheless, one wants to strive for this. And one wants to strive for it, I think, first of all, in a university education. So one wants religion there. I'm not sure that I would say religion is more valuable to an undergraduate or more necessary than the study of globalization, or the study of economics, or the study of democracy. But I do think that what's essential to our undergraduates is we give them a sense of their place in the world and how to find that place and how to grow into people who have a sense of confidence that they as individuals can make a difference in the world, and that we all, despite our differences in this world, can actually cooperate to make this world a decent place to live in for most of its inhabitants, if not all of its inhabitants. Now, it seems to me that the way to do that is not to separate a sphere called values, or a sphere called ethics, or a sphere called religion, but to strive for what I think Weber actually had in mind with this notion of the university. Weber thought that the purpose of a good education is to teach us facts about the world, especially inconvenient facts. The best that our culture and our society can provide these facts. So, for example, without going into Thomas Kuhn's debate about scientific revolutions and the exact truth value of any science, I would try to stipulate that the best picture that we have of the way the world works right now is the picture that science provides. And to be a human being in the 21st century and not know anything about the cosmos, or about biochemistry, or about your place as a human being in the food chain, or about ecology and environmentalism, is to do a disservice to a human being who wants to understand that human being's place in the world. And similarly, how can we possibly understand ourselves without understanding our role as users of language? And what it is to use language, and how culture influences, shapes, sometimes even determines the limits of our thinking. So you want to give students a sense of being part of a culture and an economy and a polity, and as part of a set of polities which are interlocked in the world to a greater degree than ever before. You want them to understand these facts insofar as we know them, with attention to the limits of facts, but you want them to understand as much as we can say we know in this culture about what it is to be a human being in the 21st century. And then, finally, you want to give them the ability to think about these things. And I think the value of liberal arts, and particularly of humanities, has to be that this particular mode of inquiry gives us insight into thinking about these things and learning to talk about them with one another and to talk through the differences that we hope will surface among diverse students of all sorts in the classroom as they reflect on themselves and their world. And that's, I think, where the double degree program proves so exemplary. I like to think that the way to achieve greater cooperation in this world is not to level down differences among us. The way to pluralism is not to avoid the differences that pluralism is meant to teach us to respect. So what one wants to try to do in this world, I think, is promote strong cultural identities that can coexist with strong openness to people of other strong identities and respect for them, not despite their difference, but in and because of their difference. And I like to think that therefore the students who walk up and down Broadway between JTS and Barnard are enacting what is required right now for this world, where they're becoming stronger in what Jewish history and Jewish texts have had to say about the world in all the diversity, not one unity. We're not teaching them dogma here. We're not saying Judaism is this, Judaism says that. On the contrary, you go deep into your history, your philosophy, your texts at JTS, you understand that there is a unity in diversity in this tradition of ours. And then you walk down the street to your biology lab, or your physics class, or your government class, or your class in the history of French literature, or African dance. And you understand that there are people out there who see the world utterly differently than you do, and this world is only going to make it if we can not only cooperate with them, but respect them so much that we know we need to learn from them. And this duality, which is inherent in the dual degree, to me models what it is to be a Jew in the 21st century. To be a Jew in the 21st century is not to separate yourself off or to want to separate yourself off from this larger society, but to know that that society enriches you and is in you. It's not as if it's us and them. That world is us. We are Jewish human beings. And so the human is in us, not outside of us. The American is in us, not outside of us. And so you walk up and down Broadway, and you're enacting this dialogue between the two parts of yourself, which hopefully will not remain separate parts, but will so interfuse that you emerge as a fuller, more whole Jewish human being with a sense of what you, as that Jewish human being, have to say to the world and can contribute to the world. This, to me, says that precisely because of the conditions that President Spar outlined so cogently, right now, as the 21st century begins, there is more need for this program and what it represents than ever before. There's more need for the kind of human being, the kind of woman that this program is going to nurture than ever before, because the world needs these traits, these qualities of rootedness and openness, of trying to link together science and humanities, self and world, more than ever before. I have a great sense of excitement every time I look at the curriculum of this program, and a great sense of pride that JTS is part of it.
They are open to questions, please.
Hi. What I picked up from what you've said, and I teach history, Jewish history, and prayer at a Jewish day school to middle school students. On the one hand, it sounds like there's a model, what I want to call a humanistic model of higher education that both of you are describing, that is impassioned and one that I ascribe to. And then on the other hand, there's an economically driven model that is very prevalent in our society, that education is really there to get people jobs so that people are capable to go out into the workforce. And that more and more that's a concern at all levels, including people who are trying to send their kids to college. So are these models, the one driven by we need to have an educated workforce, and then one we need to have a humanistic human being, are they really reconcilable at this point in time in American history?
I think they're fully reconcilable. And I think I wish I could bottle what Arnie just said, because I think he gave just a brilliant explanation of why it's so important to train or to expose young people to the humanities, to philosophy, to religion, because it gives them a perspective on the world that's going to be absolutely critical. And they're going to need that whether they go on to be engineers or doctors or lawyers or what have you. If they can develop over the time of their high school and college careers the capacity to think, to reason analytically, and to deal with diversity in the world, that will make them not only successful, but will critically make them better citizens of this planet. And I think if you look around the world where we see the incredible range of problems that we see, an awful lot of them stem from what I would group under the broad rubric of intolerance, of people not having the capacity in their brains to see different sides of an argument, to see that a debate doesn't necessarily have one sole answer, to truly be able to see things from a perspective that's different from their own. And I don't think there's any better way to it's not even so much teaching, but to expose young people to these skills than through the liberal arts and particularly the humanities. So I think they're completely reconcilable, but it's not something that you can put on a bumper sticker and explain simply. We have to make the argument for it.
As a lifelong professor in the humanities, I am a strong believer in academic requirements. And the first requirement I would strengthen is the science requirement. And to do that, though, to strengthen the science and math requirements at universities, we're going to have to make better science and math teaching in our high schools, which is notoriously poor. It discourages a lot of our kids from going into science and math because they're just not taught well. And then you find by the time they get to college, they're already intimidated and discouraged, and they end up taking the Science for Poets courses, which are not the kind of science courses I want them to have. So I actually think that at this particular point in the time of the history of the world, I have a sense of world requirements and even national requirements. I think our country requires better trained students coming out of our colleges and universities. And in order to justify what in some people's eyes is a luxury of a 4-year liberal arts education. We're going to have to make a demonstrable contribution to making them citizens of our country and citizens of the world. And I would argue that one of the requirements of citizenship is a broad-based education, that you've got to come out of school understanding something about the sciences, because this is the world we live in. I would similarly say you have to come out of school able to think ethically. You have to be able to think about ethical issues. And that is also something that our schools have not been uniform in requiring. So I think the pressure's on us now, those of us in the higher education business, to justify what in the eyes of many people is a luxury. After all, there are many countries, look at Europe, which don't have the luxury of a liberal arts degree. You're an 18-year-old boy or girl in Britain, and you go right into a specialization. You could do law, you could do business, medicine as an undergraduate. You don't get this luxury, right, of a degree necessarily. And Israel is an example where on the German model, they started out specializing, and now they're going into liberal arts education, having recognized that the loss of liberal arts education is bad for the society, and now there's pressure in Israel to institute more liberal arts degrees. Well, it's expensive, but I would try to make the case that this kind of higher education is necessary to our society. We have time for a couple more questions, I think.
Joyce and then Suzanne.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. My son went to University of Chicago undergraduate, and they have a fantastic core program that they all have to take. He majored in Russian, but eventually he got to the sciences anyway because he was able to reason. They teach you how to reason, and I think that's very important.
Thank you. Suzanne.
Hi, I'm a senior in the double degree program, and it's such a pleasure to have 2 leaders of my institutions here. I was just wondering if you could talk about the role of higher education in nurturing women's leadership, because even though we have scores of women entering institutions of higher learning and earning graduate degrees, we still haven't necessarily achieved high levels of leadership in government, business, politics, and even in higher education. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the role of these institutions in nurturing women to be taking on these positions of power.
I think that one's mine. You can join it
I'll
too.
join you.
That's right. So I promise I didn't put Suzanne up to asking that question. But one of the major things that I've done in the 18 months since I've been in this job is to launch what we're calling the Athena Center for Leadership Studies, which is devoted entirely to not only helping young women become leaders, but I think integral to that goal is to help young women think about what it means to lead as a woman, and to raise the question, which is very much an intellectual question rather than a polemical question: do women lead differently? Are there different models of women's leadership? Are there some traits that tend to be more female and more male? And to pose those, again, not as political or antagonistic queries, but as genuine academic questions. And if we can start to figure out these different models of leadership, then can we teach them? And can we get young women at least to be aware of the differences they may face when they get out again into this diverse reality, and give them what they will need to become leaders? Because Suzanne's exactly right. The data is depressing. Women are more than half of college classes. As I keep telling my 17-year-old son, white males have become affirmative action because the girls are outdoing them in high school. Women are 50% of law schools, 50% of med schools, about 40% of business schools. But once you get into the top levels of any of those professions, the women's drop down to about 16%, seems to be the odd magical number, and it is no longer a pipeline issue because we've had several generations now, starting sort of with women my age, where women were 50% in college classes. So we have to tackle this issue of leadership, and I actually think the universities are the perfect place to do it because it's not a political agenda. It's not a cause, it's an academic question. Do women lead differently? And how can we develop those skills?
I'll just add on to that we're in a fascinating moment where we're beginning to see women making their way into many senior leadership positions in the Jewish world, not just in the so-called secular parts of the Jewish community but into the synagogue. And so now we're able to explore the question, which Professor Spar ended with, is how are women's leadership roles going to be different than male leadership roles? How is a woman rabbi different than a male rabbi? How is a woman cantor different than a male cantor? And to my knowledge, there is no empirical study of this yet, but my anecdotal experience is that women are able to do different things in those roles, to achieve different things in the area of spiritual leadership than men are able to do. And this is going to be a fascinating thing that hopefully we're going to be able to explore on the ground in the next couple decades.
I can't resist throwing out one anecdote because I've been so intrigued by it. We had an event at Barnard last week, and it was a global health event. But one of the people who spoke is Representative Kay Granger. She is a U.S. Congresswoman from Texas. She's the only Republican woman from Texas in Congress. Very impressive woman. We were chatting afterwards, and she is one of the chairs of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, critical subcommittee, because she said they write all the checks. But the committee is co-chaired by Nita Lowey, who I'm sure many of you in this room know. And what Representative Granger was pointing out, she said she and Nita work completely closely together. And she said they are actually not bipartisan, they truly are bipartisan on their committee. They're the only committee that's co-chaired by two women. And she said, and this is a direct quote, so, but I think I will endorse it anyhow. She said, men come to Congress to win. Women come to Congress to get things done. And it suggests a very interesting model for how you might think about unfreezing Washington, is to get a few more women in Congress who actually want to get things done.
Hear, hear. I think we have time for one more question. Sam?
I want to bring up a subject that you have obviously consciously or unconsciously avoided, namely, I have a tremendous amount of difficulty, and I apologize because I'm a psychiatrist, I shouldn't have this difficulty, in dealing with obnoxious, right-wing, orthodox, fixed positions that exclude and negate the world out there. And other than resenting it and hating it, I don't know how to deal with it. And I'm just wondering.
Need some help with this story.
You have the answer.
This is what you should take. No. Well, someone once taught me the bit of wisdom, which I don't have to teach you, you already know it, that it's very helpful never to ask for the blessing of people who are not prepared to give you the blessing. So we have to be confident enough in our own identities, who we are, in our own tradition, not to need the blessing of people who won't give it to us. And they resent us less because we don't ask for it, and we resent them less because they don't deny it to us because we haven't asked for it in the first place. So I think that one of our missions at JTS is to prepare a generation of Jews who are so grounded in their own tradition that nobody can get away with the untruthful claim that it's always been like that and that I represent the only authentic continuity of what that tradition has been. And this in turn, I think, given that the world we're living in is obviously unprecedented, it's obviously different than it's ever been before. So obviously we're going to have to draw upon this fountainhead of our tradition in ways that we haven't done before. We need the continuity all the more. We need to have this total immersion in what we've been really deep all the more so that we can cope with these challenges we have to cope with. And it doesn't work by formula, as you know. It works by sinking it into human beings who then, in the sum total of who they are, using all their creativity, can take the world and their tradition in new directions. That, I think, is the mission of this place and always has been, and particularly of TI, and particularly of the dual degree program. And so it's a necessity partly for the reasons that you mentioned. I would hate to see that vision of Judaism that this place represents lessen or wane or disappear. It would be a tragedy, I think, for Judaism and for the world.
And I'll just briefly, because this is somewhat beyond my sphere of knowledge or activity, but when I look at the world out there, I see the rise of fundamentalisms, all fundamentalisms. Everything's turning right, and the growth of fundamentalisms, not just in Judaism, in all of the religions, and in the political spectrum generally, I find it terrifying. Because when people think they know the truth, there's no arguing with them, and there's no reasoning with them. And that's why, for lack of anything more tangible to go back to, I do go back to truly the value of a liberal arts education, or the value of an analytical mode of thought that enables you to say, I have a vision of the truth, but I understand it's a vision, or a version, forgive me, and sorry, no visions, sadly. But I'm open to conversation, and I'm open to dialogue. I think that's where we get the closest approximation of truth. But sadly, I think the world that we live in is just generating, in all of these scary pockets, people and groups who believe the truth was somehow handed to them, and therefore there is no need for further inquiry. And that terrifies me. It is fanaticism.
Yes. Well, we thank you both for your versions of truth, both sobering and inspiring. And now we're off to lunch.